The rain came down in sheets that November evening, turning the city streets into rivers of reflected neon and broken dreams. Sarah clutched her daughter's hand tighter as they hurried past the subway entrance, trying to ignore the elderly woman huddled against the concrete wall, her weathered face barely visible beneath a soaked cardboard sign. But Emma, only 7 years old, stopped dead in her tracks. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice cutting through the storm like a knife through Sarah's heart. "That lady is shaking." In that moment, Sarah felt the weight of every excuse she'd ever made. Every time she'd looked away, every justification for her own comfortable indifference. Her daughter's eyes held no judgment, only pure, uncomplicated compassion, and Sarah realized with sudden clarity that the next 60 seconds would teach Emma more about humanity than a lifetime of careful words ever could. Sarah knelt down beside her daughter, rain soaking through her wool coat, the one she'd saved 3 months to buy. "You're right, sweetheart," she said softly. The woman against the wall couldn't have been more than 60, but the streets had aged her, carved lines of hardship into skin that might have once been smooth. Her sign read simply, "Homeless, hungry, anything helps." "God bless." The words were running now, blue ink bleeding into cardboard, much like Sarah suspected the woman's hope had been bleeding away. Day after day, in the face of thousands of averted eyes. "Excuse me," Emma said, her small voice somehow audible above the storm. The woman looked up, startled, as if she'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen. "Are you cold?" The question was so simple, so devastatingly direct, that Sarah felt tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. The woman's lips trembled as she tried to smile. "I'm all right, little angel. Don't you worry about me." But Emma was already shrugging off her favorite pink jacket, the one with the unicorn patch her grandmother had sewn on last Christmas. "Here," she said, holding it out with both hands like an offering. "You need this more than me." "Emma, honey, wait," Sarah started to say, then stopped. What was she about to do? Tell her daughter that kindness had limits? That compassion came with conditions? She watched as the woman's face crumpled, not with sadness, but with something Sarah recognized as the painful surprise of unexpected grace. "I can't take your coat, sweetheart," the woman said, her voice cracking. "You'll catch your death." "I have another one at home," Emma insisted, which wasn't quite true. She had a thin windbreaker, nothing that would keep out this kind of cold. "Please. My grandma says when you give something away, it makes your heart bigger." Sarah made a decision. She took off her own coat and wrapped it around Emma, then helped the woman into the pink jacket. It was absurdly small on her, barely covering her shoulders, but the woman clutched it like it was made of gold. "I'm Margaret," she said, tears streaming down her face. "And you just gave me the first kindness I've felt in 6 months." The story poured out of Margaret in fragments, between shivers and sobs. A husband lost to cancer, medical bills that consumed their savings, a landlord who wouldn't wait, a daughter somewhere in California who didn't return calls anymore. The slow, terrible slide from middle-class respectability to sleeping on cardboard, invisible to the endless stream of people who passed by. "I used to be a teacher," Margaret said, and Sarah heard the echo of who she'd been in those words. "4th grade. I taught kids like your Emma here how to read, how to be kind, how to matter. Funny how fast you can go from mattering to this." "You still matter," Emma said with the fierce certainty only children possess. "You matter a lot." Sarah pulled out her phone, fingers numb from the cold. She had $43 in her checking account and rent due in a week. But she opened her banking app anyway. Then she stopped. $43 wouldn't change Margaret's life. It would buy her a meal, maybe a night in a shelter, and then what? She thought about the system that had failed this woman, about the thousand small cruelties that had led to this moment, about how she was part of that system every time she walked past without seeing. "Margaret," Sarah heard herself saying, "my apartment is small, but I have a couch. Just for tonight until we can figure something out. It's warm and dry and nobody should be out here in this weather." Margaret's eyes went wide. "I couldn't possibly." "You don't know me." "I could be. I might be." "You're a 4th grade teacher who fell on hard times," Sarah said firmly. "And you're coming home with us." "Emma, what do you think?" Her daughter's face split into a grin that could have lit up the entire city. "Yes, we can make hot chocolate." The walk to Sarah's apartment took 20 minutes, and in that time, Sarah wrestled with a dozen doubts. What was she doing? Bringing a stranger home? What would her sister say, always so practical and cautious? What if this was a mistake? But every time she looked at Emma, skipping ahead despite the rain, periodically turning back to make sure Margaret was still following, she knew that some things were more important than caution. Some moments defined who you were going to be. The apartment was indeed small, a one-bedroom in a building that had seen better decades, but it was warm and clean. And when Margaret stepped inside, she broke down completely. "I haven't been inside in so long," she sobbed. "I forgot what it felt like to be warm." Sarah made hot chocolate while Emma showed Margaret her collection of books, chattering about her favorites. She pulled out dry clothes, made up the couch with her best blankets, and heated up the leftover soup she'd made for the week. It wasn't much, but watching Margaret eat with slow, grateful bites, Sarah realized that kindness didn't require much. It just required showing up. That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah and Margaret talked. Really talked. Margaret shared stories about her teaching years, about the kids she'd loved and lost track of, about the husband who'd been her whole world. Sarah shared her own struggles. A single mom working 2 jobs, trying to give Emma everything, while feeling like she was always falling short. They were 2 women separated by circumstances, but connected by something fundamental. Some shared understanding of what it meant to survive, to hope, to keep going even when the world felt impossibly hard. "Why did you help me?" Margaret asked finally. "Really?" Sarah thought about it. "Because my daughter saw you. And because I realized that we're all just a few bad breaks away from where you are. But more than that. Because pretending not to see people doesn't make them disappear. It just makes us smaller." The next morning, Sarah called in sick to her waitressing job, something she never did. She spent the day making phone calls, navigating the labyrinth of social services, homeless assistance programs, and temporary housing options. She discovered a teacher's retirement fund Margaret hadn't known she could access, found a social worker who specialized in helping educated homeless women, and connected Margaret with a shelter that could provide transitional housing for up to 6 months. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Margaret didn't instantly get her old life back, but she got a pathway forward, a chance to rebuild. 3 weeks later, Sarah received a text from an unknown number. "This is Margaret. I'm in the transitional program. I have my own room and a job interview next week. They need substitute teachers at a school in Queens. Emma saved my life. You both did. I'll never forget." Emma was the one who insisted they frame Margaret's text message and hang it on the refrigerator. "So we remember," she explained seriously, "that people aren't invisible unless we make them invisible." 6 months later, Sarah was working her evening shift at the diner when a woman walked in dressed in neat slacks and a cardigan. It took her a moment to recognize Margaret, transformed not just by clean clothes and a haircut, but by the light that had returned to her eyes. "I got the job," Margaret said, pulling Sarah into a hug. "Full-time 4th grade starting in September. And I wanted you to have this." She handed Sarah an envelope. Inside was a check for $500. "It's not nearly enough," Margaret said quickly, seeing Sarah's protest forming. "But it's a start. For Emma's college fund or whatever she needs. That little girl taught me that the world isn't as cold as I'd started to believe. That kindness still exists. That people still see each other if we're brave enough to look." Sarah tried to refuse, but Margaret was insistent. "You taught me something too," Margaret continued. "You taught me that asking for help isn't the end of dignity. It's the beginning of healing. That accepting kindness doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. And that every single person we pass on the street has a story, has value, has the same fundamental need to be seen and valued and remembered." That night, Sarah told Emma about Margaret's visit. Her daughter listened solemnly, then said something that Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. "Mommy, we should title her." "What do you mean, honey?" "Like in books. Everyone important gets a title. Margaret should be the teacher who came back." Because she did. She came back from being invisible. Sarah smiled through her tears. "You're right. We should title her. And you know what? She titled us too. We're the people who stopped and saw her. And that's who I want to be. Every single day." The check went into Emma's college fund, but the lesson went somewhere deeper. into the place where we store the truths that shape us. On cold nights, when Sarah passed people huddled in doorways, she no longer looked away. She couldn't fix every problem or save every person, but she could see them. She could acknowledge their humanity. She could stop even for a moment and recognize that behind every cardboard sign was a teacher, a parent, a person who'd once had dreams and might have them again. Emma grew up understanding that kindness wasn't weakness, that compassion wasn't naive, and that the small acts we think don't matter often matter most. She learned that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear pink jackets with unicorn patches and see the world with eyes unclouded by cynicism or fear. And Margaret? She taught for another 15 years before retiring with dignity. She never forgot the night a child's simple question, "Are you cold?" became the beginning of her resurrection. She kept that pink jacket in her closet, too precious to wear, a reminder that sometimes salvation comes not from grand gestures or government, programs or systemic changes, though all those matter, but from one person choosing to see another, really see them, and deciding that this moment, this human being is worth stopping for. In a world that often feels too big and too broken, where problems seem insurmountable and individual actions seem pointless, Emma's question echoes still, "Are you cold?" It's an invitation to notice, to care, to act. It's a reminder that we all have the power to title each other, to decide whether the people around us will be invisible or invaluable. And it's a challenge to choose every single day to be the kind of person who stops in the rain and sees what everyone else walks past. Because in the end, that's what changes the world. Not the big, impossible things we can't do, but the small, essential things we choose not to do. Look away, stay silent, keep walking. The things we decide instead to do. Stop, see, care, act. Title her. Title him. Title them. Title every person you pass as someone who matters, someone who's seen, someone whose story is still being written. And in doing so, write your own story as someone who chose kindness when indifference was easier, who chose connection when isolation was safer, who chose to be fully, courageously human. That's the story. That's always been the story. We just have to be brave enough to live it.